Hi, everybody. Um, I'm Agyei. Um, I'm a multidisciplinary designer. I'm trying to be rigorous about that, and I'm trying to lean into it as well. And I guess I should say I'm getting out of the graphic design game a little bit. I recently founded a startup that I'm hoping can help me resolve my relationship with some of the economics around graphic design and business. And in the same way, I've been thinking a lot about typeface design and my relationship with it and the world that I live in. So, yes, I'm a multidisciplinary designer, but these days I'm just rethinking things. A little bit of background. I was born in Trinidad, where I currently live and work with my partner and my dog. It's really beautiful. It's special. I think it's special because there's a lot of input. It's one of the most robustly culturally and racially diverse spaces in the world. And the diversity isn't by accident. Like most of the Caribbean islands, Trinidad was forcefully inhabited by European invaders. And in a desire to maximize profits, they brought in African slaves to work these sugar plantations that now help to kickstart ubiquitous companies like Cadbury and Tate& Lyle. And after a few hundred years of this, slavery was abolished and Black people began working in industry, either for colonial governments or as part of the private labor forces that were made up by various private companies that would have established themselves by the time. After slavery was abolished, in an attempt to keep a hold on the sugar economy that they'd worked so hard to build in Trinidad, Europeans first imported Chinese labor, and then they quickly transitioned to East Indian labor. And the transition to East Indian labor was under the pretense of, work now and then you get paid and then you go back home later. But they got screwed over and they stayed and they built lives. And so did those same Chinese people. And later on, Portuguese people, Syrian people. It's a really special place. And that kind of cultural and racial integration over time has led to some really fascinating, beautiful outputs of festival and music. And there's a lot of cultural exuberance and a lot of expression in that direction. But this is a design talk. It's not a tourism board infomercial. But I had to spend a little bit of time on context. Explosions in industry typically demand and are precipitated by a need to communicate faster and better and more efficiently. Longer life expectancies in Europe, we know why, but those meant that there were more people and more people had more things to say, and the type found itself pretty well situated. So there was a lot of work that was being made to make commercial types that helped these new economies that were starting up. By the early 20th century, we had a diverse range of types that were all about function and utility and reproduction, but some of them were also about ornament and decoration and brand identification. It was a really good time for type and money's relationship. And type was also becoming ingrained in commerce in a way that it hadn't before or couldn't. Foundries like Linotype and Stevenson and Blake were creating works that really helped, I think, celebrate the past few hundred years of kicking everybody's ass. And they helped usher in and support this new relationship between type and commerce. And much like type expedited progress in commerce and in education and in communication in Europe and in the so-called Western world, it also expedited the effects of European colonialism. And it began the first set of work in what I would think of as otherizing the rest of the world after slavery was ended. And the otherizing is a real world, immediate, physical thing. But I also feel like they began this work in placing the developed or civilized so-called world into one context, and then everybody else in the rest of the world in another. And now that colonial powers were either being usurped or the capitalist benefit from colonialism was dwindling because of the reality of natural resources, a lot of these newly post-colonial spaces were having to contend with rules and societal structures and hierarchies that were never created for them. Post-colonial spaces began to look like odd facsimiles of the so-called mother countries, but only in the dressing of themselves, only it seemed in a seeming attempt to make it look palatable to some unseen superior class. And if I'm honest, I'm a little bit morbidly fascinated with this dynamic, this relationship of civilized primitive and this idea of post-colonial spaces where there's this culture of trying to make things look like they're from the spaces that dominated them, but from a perspective of rightness. And I've also been interested in the perspectives on the other side as well, in the way that these people from dominant cultures see the dominated. And I think that this relationship is related to what we now call vernacular design. When I look up definitions of vernacular design, there's a lot of focus on work made with local needs to address local concerns using local methods. But it's always a term that's used to describe design elsewhere. So even in the context of the same country, there's a very clear delineation of vernacular design happening over there, and then real design is happening over here, where we're calling that other kind of design vernacular. So this is vernacular design as an example. But this is elevated to architecture. This is vernacular lettering. But this is graphic design. And I guess depending on your tolerance for this kind of thing, it's also typography. But in this case, I'm not talking about what the thing actually is. We'd call design for as long as we're in one of these academic left-wing pro-diversity conversations, but there's an anthropological fascination that carries work from specifically certain spaces into this kind of space that canonical, traditional, Eurocentric design doesn't typically have to contend with. So at home in Trinidad, especially now, since I've been home in a way that feels really decided and set in, I've been thinking a lot about this local or even Caribbean aesthetic, which is something that we're always doing this inward-outward gaze with. And to me, it always feels like a lobsters and exotic women association that's coming with the Caribbean and spaces like ours. And we're encouraged to associate ourselves with that. And it's good for the tourism industry when we do. But I feel like there's a lot of reality and humanity on the ground that gets ignored when we look at spaces like mine like that. And if we're talking about graphic design as reproduced communication en masse that's made intentionally visual to draw attention and to send a message, and I think about the Caribbean aesthetic, then for me, the most emblematic example of that would be the Handmade Time. Late 19th and early 20th century printing in the Caribbean was operating at world-class standards at the newspaper and editorial level, and at some manufacturing levels as well. Many of our newspapers were staffed by well-trained people who were using modern equipment and educated in the so-called mother country's best schools. But after independence, after a little bit of retraction, because of how many government services around printing and manufacturing were dependent on cheap or no-cost imports of not just technology, but also training and manufacture, printing's relationship with the power at this time started to become more related to buying power. Independent commerce was exploding because there were a whole new classes of people who were actually able to start businesses. So we're thinking about people who would have been now saving for maybe one generation or two generations. And the needs around public communications because of that became different. Neighborhood sign painters became integral to the cottage industry. And in countries whose GDP is accounted for by the generationally wealthy and the aggressively working class, with a very, very big gap between them, this kind of communication was the only one that you had if you just, for example, opened a food place, or if you had an auto shop, or if you had some coconut water to sell, or if you didn't want anybody parking in front of your shit, or if you really didn't want anyone parking in front of your shit. If you had a bar and you had some booze to sell. And this became more or less the way to do small business and to still make work that was of a visible, identifiable, recognizable scale while keeping your marketing materials low cost. And in a space where you have these large gaps of wealth that were created by colonialism and the things that trickle through a society for the generations after it, this kind of service is invaluable. I mean, it's important to note that this isn't how everything got done, but this is how most of it got done. So manufactured signage and vinyl and large installations, they were existent, but they were more or less for one class of business person, and everybody else had these handmade signs. And if we look at them from a functional point of view, these signs became a really democratizing tool for so-called small economy in Trinidad, and not just here. There's a tradition of deep invested craftsmanship and sign painting throughout the Caribbean. And a lot of the time, tourists visit and they're like, oh, wow, that's super quaint or whatever. And we're just like, dude, that's the bar. Could we go to it? But beyond that kind of cutesy stuff, these signs and the practices around them are, in my opinion, a real cornerstone of economic development, especially because in our space and in spaces like it, there's such disparities in terms of access to technology. Something I really loved about paying attention to these signs was what I saw as a kind of a built-in defiance. So a kind of a making your version of the thing that's probably manufactured somewhere else in the more so-called developed world. And after enough time of being adaptive and inventive, functional aspects become married to the aesthetic components, and we end up with work that becomes what I would call elevated to high craft. And this tradition of functional sign painting that's elevated to high craft and using expressive modes of design isn't a Caribbean phenomenon, but it is a post-colonial phenomenon. And it makes sense if we look at things like barbershop signs in Ghana, which are painted to show examples of popular haircut styles. So instead of an elaborate description of how each hairstyle can work, you'll use a hairstyle theme, for example, and you'll give it a title for easy reference. And these, in my opinion, would be examples of really considered illustration and handmade typography, but also examples of solutions that were designed to exist in a context set up somewhere else. There wasn't always a history of getting fresh American style haircuts, but the closest analog to these barbershop signs are these, which I think most Black men would identify pretty immediately as like almost like lookbooks for sample styles. So you can get these numbered or named, and you'd have some idea of what you're gonna get, and you can let the barber know. And these types of signs are performing exactly that same function. And typically they get made with relatively simple materials, sure. So, we're talking about paint, sometimes chalk, hand-eye coordination, and that's it. These could probably be a lot more simply executed, but there's the intention behind it, and there's pride in work, and there's craftsmanship. In India, another post-colonial space, there's a very well-documented tradition of sign painting on public transport buses. And this lettering it's bright, it's colorful, it's layered, and in my opinion, has a lot in common with the same work from Ghana that I just showed. Or even work from Haiti, which is the literal global epicenter of Black revolution. There's a lot to be said about this kind of response in spaces where European powers entered, and then they replaced the de facto modes of rulership, but also of communication and operation and government and justice and economics. And then they left. The people who were there and left behind were left with a context for these things that weren't necessarily idealized for their spaces or their circumstances. And I suppose that's where a lot of this type of work finds its roots, needing to solve the same problems with different materials. And I think that the otherizing of this very valid design that emerges kind of flower-like as a response to brutal oppression, like so many of these spaces have endured, and putting it into the little vernacular design box is a little disrespectful. But that's just me. If you ask me what I thought would be the most emblematic feature of the Trinidadian design language, I'd tell you about the party signs. So in Trinidad in the late 60s, early 60s, a couple of things happened which were important. The first one was that we gained independence from vicious imperialist British rule. The second one was that Sparrow lost the Calypso monarch to the mighty Douglas, which at the time was an extremely crazy upset. This was like revolutionary. And thirdly, around the world, people were finding new ways to party. Small economies and increased financial stability from industrialization and disco music meant that parties were happening everywhere, all the time. The frequency of these parties would have increased as people had more disposable income. And for a country on the brink of an oil boom, this meant that there was a strong need to shake your ass and to watch yourself and to show them what you're working with. And there had to be some way for us to know where these parties would be and who would play at them and what time they'd start. And this is a phenomenon that didn't happen exclusively in Trinidad or even just in the Caribbean, for whom at this time independence from colonial powers was either fledgling or cusping. These kinds of movements were happening all over the world. But Trinidad's rich offerings, especially at the same time with local music, meant that there were whole economies that were created around these live parties that were able to be held quickly and often. And the work made for these parties would be tacked to poles that used either for telephones or above ground electrical wires. I mean, there's not really a system of approval of where they get put up, it's like wherever there's foot traffic. But you want people to know where your party is. And this always means that, over time, since there isn't a system of management around them, that they are going to be a part of the visual landscape. And that means that the visual landscape will get affected. And I think perhaps in a way that they weren't important 30 years ago, they're a lot more important now. And they're part of our landscape. And these party signs are everywhere. And by the thousands, and not just in Trinidad. And while this format was first used for parties and events, now they're used for everything. And they're always in a specific format. They're either made on hardboard or they're pre-cut or cut for the purpose. And an interesting reality is that, especially in this format of sign, most of the really good ones are made in one place by one man in a shop in Eastern Trinidad. It's rare that one person is able to shape a visual narrative as much as Bruce Kioni has in the event signage space in Trinidad. He has a consistency in approach and a style and a strong sense of craftsmanship that have made him one of Trinidad's most sought after providers of inexpensive, high quality, attractive, effective signage. When I first started looking at type more seriously, I was obviously very obsessed with this because I'm from Trinidad and I've been looking at these my whole life. And with pretty good reason. There was an aspirational amount of influence there to have, and in a simple and unobtrusive way as he'd done it as well, because he's not a douchebag, he's a really nice guy, and it wasn't just the party stuff, he had a lot of work to pay attention to. And this meant that, especially since I had just learned about digital design and some of the ways that I could, do things with it, I wanted to bring this work into that, very formal space. And I think that when you want to do that, the early work is always like a transliteration of somebody's sign and you trace somebody's sign. So this is a project that I worked on where I was able to help another Trinidadian designer named Christian Chen, who commissioned basically one-off illustrations of letters that we then vectorized and then put it into a font programming software. And it was called Fat Font. But it didn't really sit well with me. It didn't feel like this was what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was design stuff. And this didn't feel like design. It felt like tracing. And tracing could be a great way to replicate the feeling of a thing, but I had a problem with it. Firstly, it didn't feel like enough service to this thing that I was trying to capture, which was not necessarily a particular way of drawing, but more a particular way of getting a point across. And apart from not really feeling like this was a design challenge or like it was design at all, there was also an economic and professional reality at the same time I was dealing with, because Bruce is a living, practicing sign painter in a country with a small population. And while I think really early, I started asking myself, do I want to make work that's like essentially appropriating somebody's hand style to make a font so that they can co-opt his work at scale, which is what fonts are really good for. I didn't want to introduce that impact or that unpredictable impact into Bruce's career. And at the same time, there were a lot of what I suppose people would call tributes to his work that to me felt a little bit not great. It felt like there was more access to international markets for those people than for him, and it never felt like something he wanted to set up. And I kind of wanted to step aside and ask myself, what am I actually looking for here? So I kept looking, and I began looking at other Caribbean islands beyond Trinidad. And this is when I began seeing similar work in Jamaica. And these works operate in the same kind of highly influential capacity like Bruce's does. There are a few more shops in Jamaica, but not that many. And what I felt was that in looking at these works, that I was starting to find commonalities and asking myself, perhaps it wasn't so much a particular set of aesthetics that I should be trying to capture, but instead a particular kind of feeling. I was also then working on a brand identity for a restaurant in Williamsburg called Clyde's, and Clyde's is a Caribbean restaurant. And I was using I was using the influence of sign painting, not just in Trinidad, but also in Jamaica, as part of the reference for this brand identity. And it was only after I started seeing some lettering that was inspired by these works. And after I did this branding, which I used Stephen Nixon's recursive for, which was also inspired by sign painting, I began to realize that there was consistency and there was something to continue paying attention to. And in spite of the fact that some of these spaces have relatively removed histories of involvement, one thing that they do share is a common history. And that history's created problems and circumstances and contexts that are relative and relatable to probably every Caribbean person, but would probably also find analogs in the urban Philippines or in Brazil or in the Congo. And you can tell that there's a thread that runs through the work across these spaces. And I wanted to keep pulling that thread. So I started drawing and I started paying attention to what I thought were common things and ways of doing things. And I started making some mistakes, which is how I think everybody gets everything done. And I was drawing and drawing and drawing and not quite accomplishing what I was trying to do. But I also think that by then I hadn't really figured out what that was. I did have enough language by now, though, and I did know how I wanted it to make me feel. And at the same time, I was looking at a lot of 20th century era design works. And I was paying attention to, this kind of school. And in my opinion, the best one of these would be Grandy. I think it's like what everybody thinks Skill Sans should be, and like they give it that credit, but it also doesn't have any of the ignominious undertones. But I knew whatever I was drawing, I wanted it to have that same utility, that same broad application, because it felt like the more that I was able to distill this feeling, if I were able to represent it in text, then I would definitely be sure that I was capturing the spot that I was trying to catch. So I started drawing this. And I was like, okay, maybe something is happening here. I'm not 100,000% sure, but I kept drawing and I kept drawing and I kept drawing. And I realized that in drawing repeatedly, I could start to have some of that feeling. Because it was about the feeling. There was no common aesthetic that I could have locked down. There were too many spaces, but there was something that was common. And what I was doing was I was injecting direct reference from these works, but I was also using them as the model for thinking of the way that whatever tool made these could work. And yes, sure, we're talking brush, but it's more than just that sometimes. So what I did was, after I drew a quick A to Z, I put it through the standard test for a typeface, which is you set the name of a startup in it against a millennial space gray. And if it stands up, then you've got yourself a good font. The design that I created initially had a horizontal stress, because sometimes things have horizontal stress. But that tends to end you up in a kind of cowboy typography territory, depending on the amount of thick, thin contrast that you have. And I was really committed to creating something that worked and functioned as text, because this wasn't about tracing, this was about capturing a feeling. And if I could distill it into readable running text, then yeah, that would be the real magic. So this horizontal stress running text dynamic had a couple of compensations that needed to happen. So there's pretty generous ink traps to compensate rather for the darkening that could happen on some of these joins, with especially with lowercase horizontal stress letters. With sans serif horizontal stress letters, you can end up with a little bit of a wobbliness. So I flared the stems a little bit, and that's a trick that I learned from studying Nina Strosinger's Nordfest typeface. And I was also talking a lot to Eben Sorkin, who was instrumental in the design of Darden Studios' Halia family, but is also the principal designer of Merriweather, one of the most used fonts on the internet. And something me and Eben talk a lot about is feeling. And in a world of way more fonts than we probably even think there are, if there's something we should probably be trying to hone and really consider and think about with design, it should be about the feeling it evokes. And I honestly think that we have enough models for, emotionless utilitarian design. And we also have good enough tools now to help you draw a curve. So for me, somebody who has a lot of issues with the amount of time that it takes a font to reproduce and what that means environmentally, getting to the heart of why with this font was really important. Eben agreed a lot with this intention of personality that I was trying to imbue. And he recommended thinking about the typeface that I'd drawn, which was decidedly a little too glimmery for long reading text, and exploring the possibilities for extracting what we could probably call a text version and a display version. And the text version would have all the fittings of something that would work for long reading text, you know, higher excite and lower contrast, and a decidedly less distracting vertical stress. And then what that means is that we could end up with this distinction that's really just deciding to take both paths at the fork in the road. And there was still something about these letters and the one that inspired them that made me think about home. And making me think about home, it made me also think about this idea of having to get things done on your own and having to figure it out and operate in a space where you've retrofitted your experience based on some factors that were introduced, some of which have sinister undertones, but all of which really make you part of who you are. And there's some irreverence. There's a little bit of bawdiness. There's a little bit of go fuck yourself. And hopefully there's also a strong sense of pride and attention to craft. And for me, especially as somebody who's operating in this very Eurocentric, westernized type design space, this idea of being high craft as something that exists on your own terms is really important. I was really interested in the idea of making a text design from this because I never thought of it. And I think that sometimes when you have an interesting design, there's always a few things about it that make it special to you. And I was worried that maybe a vertical stress and a higher excite and more even contrast would take away from this, but I was really lucky to be wrong. And what that meant was also that I was really locking into this feeling that I was looking for. The deviation also meant that I had some space to push the boundaries of some of the design elements that would have made it a fun display typeface and really zero in on those features. And if I did that, I'd end up with two distinct members of the same family. And this family is designed to express defiance and willfulness and pride and exuberance and a live, vibrant energy that I love about home. But it's also an energy that I feel when I'm on the beach in St. Vincent. And I'm pretty sure I'd feel it whenever I descend into Accra. And it's hopefully an energy that we're able to hold on to in the italics. And, you know, it would be nice if we can have some of that same freeness and exuberance that brushstrokes help to imbue. And a lot of these features are screaming hard to come out as lettering, but I was hoping to find some threads in the casual style developed in central Trinidad by Hugh Andrew, who was another veteran sign painter. And I didn't really start identifying the works that I was referencing as his until I was well into drawing this. And that felt really, really good to me. It felt referential. It felt honest. It felt unpretentious. And it felt like it could make me think about home. And when I think about home, I think about home being a shared space with people who share collective history more than a shared origin. And I have to give a lot of consideration to where this design came from. And I think I've been trying to think a lot more about where everything comes from in my life in general. My friend Hrant likes to say, Hrant likes to say a lot of things, right? but he does like to say that a lot of design isn't about who designs it. It's who it's for. And I disagree with Hrant on a lot of things, but I couldn't agree with him more on that point. And this typeface finds its roots in these works that are created out of struggle and adaptiveness and resolute determination and pride in your work. And the conversation that it's a part of is a diasporic one. It's a conversation around the people who've decided to do something in a particular way, not always just because they had to, but often because they could. And because of that, I'm pretty resolute about this typeface having a base for what I'm wanting to call African language support. The good thing about African language support is that there's so few precedents that you can kind of figure out how to deal with it on your own. And while I feel like full continental support is a nice aspirational thing, if this typeface is meant to operate in a retail context, then it makes sense to think about where it could be used. When I think about the languages that are advertised for support on a lot of Foundry websites, it's all in an obvious slant to what I would call, well, actually, it's to what you would call the developed world. But it's really the white world, right? And the world has been changing relentlessly for decades, but I don't know that that positioning inside of the design world has changed. And when we look at the African languages specifically that are mentioned in these lists, because there are some of them, it's ones that you honestly don't need to do any extra work for. And if we're looking into language use in print and the potential for a new user base, it's also people that they don't need to think about. If we even look at the tools that we use to make the work that we make and the frameworks that they set up, kind of by default to say that this is worth proofing, this language is important, that's a decision that someone has to make, but it's a decision someone has to make with an intended target audience in mind. So I've been working on a model for language coverage with this typeface that covers a few major tribal languages. And a few can be a good start if I focus on the top 5. It's more complicated than it seems because there are a lot of dialectic variations that really require more research than Wikipedia would give you, but I've got the backing for it. And the thing is that this is just if we're thinking about Africa, we're talking about as many English speakers as are currently in the United States right now, or half as much, sorry. But it doesn't take a lot of diacritical research, it just takes some time and a little bit of caring. And I think that we talk a lot about fonts taking 5 years to get profitable and 5 years to take and 5 years to catch in the industry. And if we look at the fact that these languages will probably be used in the fastest developing economies in the world in 5 years, then that means that the reason that these languages aren't prioritized isn't because of what money. It's about something deeper than that, because all of the important type decisions happen because of what money. It is an opportunity, though, to work on this idea of making learning resources. So what I'm able to do while I'm proofing the drawing of this typeface is when I have the chance for a new accented glyph, for example, is I can do a search for a word that uses it and use the same language learning tool that I created for the Afaka project, which scrapes a website and gives you a kind of word of the day style generation on a phrase or a meaning. And that means that I can start to teach myself Igbo and Shona and a couple other languages while also getting to test and proof and make this font for its target audience. I don't want this to be one of those things where I draw the A to Z stuff and then start filling it in with acutes and grabs and glyph construction. And then, like, if I really give a shit and I want to impress the type design bros, I'll do Vietnamese diacritics. Like, there's nothing wrong with any of that kind of approach to language support, but it doesn't really fit into my purpose. And my purpose in this is to make design for the people from whom the work draws its inspiration. It's part of a conversation about tool making. It's about the origins of the solutions that we're making, sure. But sort of right now, my focus is on working with Evan to make it a good typeface. It's important as well for me in this talk to talk about the influences that I don't want to draw from. Like I said, and I have said and will likely keep saying, type is important. And type has also, in the same breath, had a really fucked up history with the wider world. And I've been thinking about that relative to the sources of the things that we make and love and obsess over. And I have so many friends who are willfully redrawing the same Frutiger or Kazlan or Janan, not Garmin, Janan, mind you, for the snobs. And I don't really have a problem with that, right? But I don't have a connection to it. And I'm not really interested in contributing to a canon that's helped serve fascism as dutifully as the classics have. I'm not really sure in drawing that I'll end up somewhere new. And I do know that there are a couple historical precedents that need to dictate how font works, and there's some physiological precedents that dictate how reading works, but that's utilitarian, that's a utilitarian issue. And I do think that there's a lot of different ways to get to legibility and to readability and to rhythm. And maybe there's something about channeling the energy of the 17th century and making a poster with it clamoring for change that's a little bit dissonant. This new age of design loves to focus on diversity and inclusion and getting everyone in the room, especially getting me in the room. But the odds are for people like me, after you get into the room, you'll realize that the room was never meant for you anyway. And everyone's nice, but perspectives matter, and opening the door doesn't really change the nature of the room. And the more that I pay attention to that and the education systems that are set up around the industry and the norms that are set up around the industry and the way that software is built in the industry, I think it's important for us, and I'm talking about us, people like me, to make work that is reflective of our perspectives and really is valuable to us. I think that using the things that are valuable to us to make work is the best way forward. And I also think that users of type are becoming more sensitive to this. And I mean, it's a generalization to say that people don't want boring geometrics anymore, but they also don't want boring grotesques. That's where the work will come from more than anything else, I think. I think the work that will matter will come from somewhere real. And I like where this work has come from. I like where it's going. It feels to me like home does. And when I titled the talk, it was in this really offhand spirit of like, well, you know, it's about vernacularity and it's about a big push for embracing your own aesthetics. And sure, if it needs to be said, you'll probably find more interesting work looking at the niches that make your culture special. But I realize that that's a statement that's not only really true for people like me, but maybe it needs to be said because we've been defaulting to someone else's experience for hundreds of years. And maybe we can do a real evaluation of the tools we use and the education systems and the reasons that we make the work that we do and the justification for the hundreds of hours and the time and the care and the electricity and the Python scripting and the text messages to DJR and the long debates about trademark names that we put into fonts. And perhaps when we start thinking a little bit more about where the work is coming from, then we'll start making the new work that everybody's trying to talk about and advertise. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you so much, Agyei. I don't know if you can hear, we can hear some clapping. Normally the room would be absolutely full of applause, but thank you very much. It's nice to have some, getting lots of fantastic comments. So I have seen a few.
Anybody else.
So we have got a few questions coming through and lots of really of people loving it, which is brilliant. So if you bear with me, I will just try and see the first question. So our first question is from Tracy, who says, the party signs remind me of Jamaican dancehall signs. I wonder if they are starting to die out now that people can get printed signs so cheaply. Is that happening?
Well, some of them are Jamaican party signs and they're not dying out at all. I mean, the thing is that you have to consider the economy of reproduction with these things. We're talking about, like, if there's a neighborhood party, maybe you don't need more than 20 signs. And at this economy of scale that we're talking about, 20 signs relative to 20 hand-painted signs is way more expensive. So the economy is still strong and alive. I don't think that it's going to die anytime soon. I think it's really because of the necessity of the scale that our environments are operating in. But I don't think that that's going anywhere, to be honest. I hope not, but I also don't think it is. It is my informed opinion that it's not going anywhere.
That's all we like to hear. Sam Roberts has said there's lots of similarity there. He's, if you don't know Sam Roberts, he runs the Ghost Signs and Better Letters websites, Twitter handle things going out there. And he also said that Mexico has a strong tradition of these temporary event signs, although they are used on walls, which is quite interesting as poster link. Harant says, this feels nicely, I can't pronounce this name very well, so I'll do my best to pronounce it, Blomsma, which Yves Peters agrees with.
I think he's referencing a typeface.
Yes, yeah, a type designer. Yeah, so I do know the type designer, just I'm terrible at pronunciation, so apologies. Yves Peters agrees and says, great stuff. Louisa has said, I'm mind blown by this presentation. As a designer from Brazil who has lived abroad for years, I noticed how my perception of Brazilian design and typographic landscape changed after I lived abroad and started visiting Brazil. Has your perception of the Caribbean typographic landscape changed over the years at all? I love how you talk about this graphic language as it is without condescension. Did this way of seeing come naturally, or has it been a process?
I want to say it was natural because that is like the really fun thing to say. But to be honest, I think that when you grow up, like I'm very lucky that I've been able to develop a lot of my practice on my own. So I didn't spend a lot of time in school, but I did spend a lot of time admiring the wider design world. And I think that it's really kind of inescapable to have these reference points. Like, I mean, if you ask a young 20-year-old designer in Trinidad who his heroes are, he's going to tell you Michael Beirut. He's going to tell you Eddie Opara. Like he's going to like reference the names that we all know about from a book or two. And I think that it's only really after you're able to. I think for me, one of the most helpful things is that I met some of these people and they're not as amazing as they seem. But also, I think that one of the realities is that there is a kind of it's the same like the image that I showed of the Congo dandies. So these guys from the Congo who are wearing these, like, honestly, too hot suits, just too hot. I mean, apart from too European, just too hot, right? But it's the same thing. It's like this kind of a desire to retrofit your perspective so that it feels more palatable. And yeah, that's natural. I think that like that is how abuse works. You see yourself from the perspective of your abuser, but I think that it's only after I honestly started looking at more work and started having to admit to myself that the things and the influences that I have that have made me a good graphic designer are probably also the same things that I need to question if I want to get any better. And it was only after I started questioning them and started asking, like, why is this good? Like, it's just Helvetica on the left of the page. Like, why is that better than anything else? You know, and but that's a hard conversation to have with yourself because everything in the media is telling you that Helvetica on the left side of the page is actually how to do it properly. I hope that answers the question because that's all I have.
No, that was perfect, and so much to think about in this talk. I've been scrolling through so many fantastic comments about your talk, which I will send you later. I haven't got time to read them all out, but we've got loads more questions. So Miriam Ahmed, hi Miriam, it's nice to see you here. She says, when and why did you begin collecting photos of vernacular type signage in Trinidad? And when did you realise this was part of your motivation?
I went to New York and I realized that those handmade signs did not slap as much as ours. And as soon as I came back home, I pulled up my camera phone and I realized I needed to start documenting these because there was something special about them. It was only after I left home, I'll be really honest, like I have developed an appreciation for the space that I'm in because I've been able to visit more spaces.
Yeah, I think sometimes going away and coming back gives you different perspectives on wherever home is.
Sure.
So yeah, absolutely. Venetia has said, brilliantly done, wonderfully structured, a flawlessly flowing narrative and a conceptually powerful presentation, a lovely Caribbean voice.
Pretty heavy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reading out a couple of the choice comments for you. So Yves Peters has said, keeping in mind that you designed the typeface for a specific audience, if I understood you correctly, would it feel like appropriation if a middle-aged white man used it for, say, a corporate brochure or an annual report?
Sorry, I almost said yes just because you said a middle-aged white man. I was like, yes, that's appropriation. But no, I don't think. I mean, it's a font. Like, I mean, it's fonts of fonts. I think we need to stop thinking that fonts get to be more special than being things on screens. They are about who's using them, sure. When the CIA uses your font, it's bad. But that's because the CIA is bad. You know what I mean? Like the CIA usurps countries and they topple democracies. And if your typeface is used to sanitize that image, then yes, your work is being used for bad. But I think that it comes down to why you're using the work at the end of the day. Like I don't think there's an inherent nature of the work because of who's using it. I think that that's like honestly a really confusing, challenging thing that we've been having to deal with because not just because someone is using something or looks a particular way and is using something, that means that it's an inherent net good.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, don't use it for the CIA, Black people, but yes, use it for a charity, white people, you know?
Absolutely. Liz Fraser has just left a comment which I think is really interesting. She says, opening the door doesn't change the room. Thank you for inviting us to all come out of the room and look around. It's been wonderful hearing about the wider context and perspective of your work. Erin has said, do you think that it makes sense for the current design competitions, publishers and organisations to try to recognise and elevate work from around the world? Or would it be more authentic and respectful to tear down the old systems and start over with new organisations not based in the US and Europe?
Thanks for getting happy. I think that, you know, to be honest, like, I am very much a burn it the fuck down. Like that's how I am as a person. Like that's my personality type. But I think that the more that I become ingrained in industry and honestly as a business owner and like somebody who's just kind of changed their roles professionally over the past few years, I think that there is some value in assessing the systems and perhaps not dismantling them, but asking ourselves what parts of them do we want to pull out? Because like things can be complicated, right? Like they don't have to be like net good or net bad immediately. Like I think the TDC is a good example of one of them. Like the TDC went through some shit last year, and the reason that the TDC went through some shit last year was because one, people love the internet, and also because there was a system and it was obviously broken, but they had the choice of either we can like repair the system or we can dismantle it. And I think that the initial reflex knee-jerk reaction was let's dismantle it. But the reality is that there's so many, it's hard, right? Because there are Black people who benefited from the TDC competition. The first TDC ascender was a Black person. You know, it's hard to say that that's bad, but it kind of also is, because he's a Black person because he's there because he's making work that's referential of a particular experience at a particular time. And what we want to ask ourselves is like, would he have been there maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago? Maybe not. And then that is the question we ask about the system. Like, what about the system makes it better now for Black people to be a part of it? And if we dismantle that bit, that would be great. But I do think that it's more complicated than this either dismantling or like you also don't fix it by putting a Black person on the board. Like, you know, like there's like it's trickier than that. It's nuanced, it's complicated. It probably won't get solved overnight. You can't tweet your way to the solution, unfortunately. Like I don't have a very comfortable answer to that question because it's an uncomfortable question. But the answers that keep coming to me is that we need to acknowledge first that the system is broken. And that is the hardest part, because everybody loves to say the other system is broken until you bring up their system. And the problem is that all the systems are broken. And everybody wants to talk about every system but theirs, you know? So like the education guys want to shit on Google Fonts. The Google Fonts guys want to shit on the retail, but everybody's fucked up, right? And like, that's the problem. The problem is that everybody wants to say the problem is over there, as opposed to maybe the problem starts with me. And that's hard. That's like work. It's harder than tweeting, you know, but people like to tweet. They don't like to make themselves uncomfortable.
Very true. A very different question now. Claire has said she's jealous of your cheeky irreverence. Where does it come from?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not that irreverent. I don't have an answer to that question. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Don't be jealous of it. It gets me in a lot of trouble, and I would make a lot more money if I weren't. So there's that. Like it keeps me excluded from a lot of public profile work, because when you say you don't want it, you have to stick to your guts. So yeah.
No
don't be jealous of it. Just, Also, I have nothing to lose. I'm not one of you. That's another part of it. Like I'm over here. I have a whole practice. I have people that love me. And if this falls apart, honestly, I'll still draw type.
That's great. Thank you. Harant says, do diasporans design differently than natives?
Diasporans design like they're taught to if they're taught, and if they design like they're not taught to if they're not. It doesn't matter. If you take a Swiss boy and put him in the middle of Polynesia, if he likes to draw and solve problems, he'll probably turn into a designer. Probably won't be a Swiss one though.
Sure. Irid has said, based on your talk as a lecturer teaching the upcoming designers in Trinidad, and as someone who has studied design and learned the Helvetica aligned left is good design typography, what do you recommend I teach them? Do I ignore the Helvetica and focus more on hand painting, or do you think there's still a point purpose of learning and understanding the colonial typography history? Big question.
Does anybody want to know my favorite color? Like, what the fuck? Okay, yeah. So I think that
we'll have that one.
It's black. But as far as the that question goes, I think like I learned classic typography, but not in school, right? I learned classic typography because I bought the new typography by Jan Chickold and Grid Systems. I had like a bunch of Swiss typography books so that I could make my work palatable to the people that were hiring, right? So like there is a relationship between the work that you're making, the fact that you have to get paid, and then the fact that you want to make new work. I think there's nothing wrong with learning design. I think there's nothing wrong with learning any particular school of design, because one of the things that design, I would hope, is meant to teach you is that this isn't the only way to do that, you know. And I think that that is the only thing that we are missing kind of in the design curriculum, is that, yeah, we're going to teach you about Swiss design because that's what this lecturer knows, but that's not the best one. There's actually not a best one. It matters how your client feels, you know. Like, those are conversations that are like, that doesn't help sell the brochure for the Ivy League school, you know. Like, what sells the brochure is like, this is the best system, we're going to put your child through a rigorous system, and when they're done, they're going to enter into Michael Bay. Like, and that is the path that we want, right? But until we're willing to walk away from that path as the ideal or as the right thing to do, then we're gonna teach, like, then it makes probably sense to teach the same kind of I don't think there's anything like, I don't design like a Swiss typographer, but I know Swiss typography and its ins and outs, you know. I had to learn them first so that I can say, well, actually not for me. But I don't think there's anything wrong with any formal education system. The good thing about the Bauhaus, in my opinion, is that it formalized a way to start looking at work. And sure, it shouldn't have happened entirely right there where it did, but it did. And I think that we had this model coming out of it for like exploring work and thinking about work. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that that's really important, because when we think about design is academia, but design is also an industry, and people who are paying for design have particular expectations. The first set of work that I would have done that I would consider non-Swiss, it got me fired because my client was expecting left-aligned Helvetica. It took me getting really good at left-aligned Helvetica to be able to say, actually, you know, that thing I'm really good at, what about this? You know, like, that's a conversation to have, but it's not a conversation to happen in the school, because at the end of the day, you can teach your students to do whatever, but then they go out unhireable. And then who benefits from that? You know, designers' work.
Sure, thank you. On a slightly lighter note, Erin has asked, tell us your favourite Calypso artists.
Lord Melody, Mighty Spoiler, the Mighty Dougla, the Lord Commander, and Lord Companero, in ascending order. Descending? Ascending. Whichever one puts the most important first.
Absolutely. And Miriam has asked, how much pepper do you take on your doubles?
Slight, honestly, I'm a bit of a lightweight in that department.
Fair enough. And I think that's everything from the questions. If anyone does have anything they'd like to ask, please do type it in now. But in the meantime, I just would like to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Agyei for delivering such a thought-provoking, fantastically inspirational and inspiring, and sorry, I've said that word twice now, inspiring, just really informative, brilliant talk. So thank you very much for giving your time to do this. And thank you so much to everyone for coming. It's been absolutely brilliant. And thank you again. So yes, and there's lots of clapping happening in the
oh, you guys,
in the chat. So thank you very much. It's been absolutely brilliant. So thank you. It's been a real honor.
Thank you, everybody.
Done. Yeah, thank you very much. Lovely to see you all.